So, having just finished Tears of the Kingdom, I was wondering if it's the same case as in Breath of the Wild, where you can go to the final boss right off the gate after the tutorial area and beat him as long as you have enough weapons. There is not a lot of information on the matter right now, so I made a second playthrough and attempted to answer these questions for myself. I was not planning to make a video about it, but I ended up discovering quite a few interesting things. So I'll be pausing this whenever I have something to explain. I went to the Temple of Time, and the game wants you to complete 4 shrines on this tutorial island to make it here exactly where I'm standing right now. This is behind the temple. You can climb around it, but unfortunately there's this ascent check. The game wants you to have ascent to make it up, and I had an idea to bypass that, so I went and got Ultra Hand in the first shrine, and then I made this platform out of 3 different platforms. I brought it all the way back, which was extremely annoying, and used it to make a bridge to cross over. But unfortunately, the game doesn't let you progress. There's supposed to be a trigger here to advance the story, which is not present yet. So, realizing that I had to just complete the tutorial area as intended, I got Fuse, which ended up being more useful than I expected. Then I went to the 3rd shrine through this pretty quick snow area. And this is where you get Ascend, which also ended up being very useful. After that, I was barely able to avoid dying here by jumping to the edge of the river. I got Recall in the Temple of Time, went back to the starting area, used Ascend, and did the last shrine. This lets you just jump to the surface, and that's where the really interesting stuff began. So here, the game wants you to go to Lookout Landing, then to the castle, and then back. And that's what gives you the Paraglider. I really wanted to avoid that if possible. It's a pretty long quest, and I was wondering if beating the game without the glider was even possible. So, just like in Breath of the Wild, even if I reached the final boss, I would need many weapons. And Hyrule Castle, yet again, is full of very strong weapons. So my first idea was to find a way to make it to the floating castle. And without the glider and a stamina potion, my only idea was using Recall on one of the platforms that fall from the sky, but there didn't seem to be any. So instead, I came up with a pretty neat technique to pretty much get infinite height. You can chain Ultra Hand and Recall as long as you have 2 platforms to basically get infinite height. It's not quite infinite, it's for as long as the Recall timer allows, but by doing this, every time I can bring the platform a bit higher. So I can do this over and over and get higher every time. Just like this. I repeated this a few times until I was close enough to the castle to use Ascend. Just like that. And this was the very first time that I got this. I was definitely happy to see that it would work. Nothing against it. And it was raining, so I was very lucky to be able to not slip off. So I scoured the entire castle for weapons and pretty much anything that I found. I ended up being pretty stacked, but this was my inventory, and I was not confident that I would be able to beat all of the bosses with this, but it was as far as my inventory slots allowed. So I went down. You can land from the castle into some water, and then you have to make it below the castle. The final boss is in the depths below the castle, and without the glider, I couldn't really just jump like that. So my first idea was to use the same platform again. And I need to mention that in Breath of the Wild there is a trick to cancel your fall damage. It's patched in this game, even though I believe something of the sort is probably possible. I'll get into it later. For now, I just tried to get on this platform using Recall and land, but it's not possible. the reason it's not possible is actually very relevant to something I'll get into later, which is that when objects fall, I believe the same thing happened in Breath of the Wild. Objects fall at the same speed, pretty much the same speed as you for a couple of seconds, and then they speed up considerably. So that's what happened here. The moment that the platform sped up down, I was no longer able to stand on it. So then I attempted to, instead of landing on it, to just climbing on it all the way down, but I kept hitting the wall. So by chaining recall twice, I was able to go as far out as possible. Here I'm still trying to land on it, and here I'm just desperate. But the point was to try to climb on it just like this, being as far out as possible. And this didn't quite work. The game kicked me out of it. So I attempted some more desperate measures. This, I believe, is me trying to make a roof, yeah, so that whenever the object gets to the second speed, the roof prevents me from like flying out. Instead, it just killed me, because whenever the objects at the second speed touch you, you just instantly blow up. Here I finally came up with the first thing that I should have tried, really, or one of the first things, which is using this long platform, and instead of trying to use the smaller platforms, just use the very long one so that it wouldn't get unstable while falling midair. And this finally let me cling onto it for the entire duration. So once I made it here, I could just jump all the way down without dying. So all of this stretch here until the final boss is not very long, but it's full of enemies that more than one-shot you, and it's also full of this goop that kills you really fast. Fortunately, if you save and you tank a bit of damage through the goop and then reload the save, it always puts you at 3 hearts, no matter how many you had. So this is basically what made this possible. Every single time I reloaded with 3 hearts. So I kept going. Here I'm trying to use Ascend to climb up, because with the stamina that I had and all the goop, it was basically impossible otherwise. This is the only attempt I'm putting in the video, but I tried this for about an hour. It was very difficult and there was a Lionel behind me. I kept going forward finally, and fortunately this platform just falls, so there is nothing to worry about here. I got a few weapons and kept going ahead. There's basically 2 main things left, and one of them, well, you can see it took half of the video. Here you have to avoid these hands. They made using a sand here very annoying, until I noticed that by just going around the edges of the room, they would just not notice you. Here, that's me getting owned. This is the beginning of the game. This is me using this fused rock. I said that fuse was kind of useful because I was able to, in Hyrule Castle, fuse many of my weapons with horns from enemies. And this is the imprisoning chamber. The imprisoning chamber, I thought was maybe where my adventure would end, but fortunately you can just kind of slowly nudge your way down like this. This is my first attempt, and I made it pretty far down. I believe this mechanic of like letting go and climbing back up didn't exist in Breath of the Wild, I'm not very sure, but it made this just very possible. So I was quickly able to get past this, and this is the very final stretch. This is the jump before the final boss. You see, I was really hoping that the game would eventually just put me into the fight by hitting some trigger as I'm falling, but that doesn't happen. You need to touch the ground alive to get into the battle. So naturally my first attempt was doing the same thing, trying to grab the wall and going down slowly, but it became pretty obvious that this wouldn't work because of the layout. You just cannot go all the way down like this. So my very first, or rather second idea was this. This is what I mentioned earlier. I feel like this might work. I couldn't get this to work, but by positioning yourself in parallel with the wall and holding up and letting go of the bow like this, I was really hoping I could grab onto the wall. I tried quite a few times and I couldn't get it to work, but I would definitely not be surprised if it does work. So then I noticed that there are these boulders right next to the jump. When I saw them, I was like, oh, this is going to be very simple. The reason I thought that is because in Breath of the Wild, you can cling on to boulders. And I don't know if they got rid of the ability or if it's just these because of the material. But you cannot cling onto these. So I couldn't just cling onto them and fall off like you could easily in Breath of the Wild. Instead, what I attempted was to use them as a platform, knowing that they wouldn't work. So it doesn't work for the same reason as before, which is that you fall for a few seconds and then it just leaves you behind. I went back, I really tried to find some platform or anything that I could use. Only thing I found was this chest with bomb flowers. I tried to use them by bombing myself before hitting the ground, but that also just killed me instantly. So here I started to experiment with how recall actually worked. Here I'm trying to recall the boulder back up, hoping that when it reaches the top, I could recall it down, as in use the trajectory while it was in the recall state by recalling it backwards. That is not possible. So next thing that I tried was using two boulders attached to each other and seeing if detaching one of them and then using recall on it would recall all the way back to when it was still attached. That unfortunately doesn't work. Its memory is from the point that it got detached. So that would have been a cute way to do this, but it doesn't work. This right here is a Looney Tunes contraption. I'm trying to make the bottom boulder go up and bring the top one to me and use recall on it. That obviously didn't work. This is the weapon platform that doesn't even work because they don't have a hitbox. I still try to use it. I had something in mind, such as like making the top boulder cushion my fall when the bottom one leaves me behind. That naturally didn't work, and like I mentioned before, when they get really fast and they hit you, you just die instantly. So as many times as I tried, hoping for something different to happen, the same thing was just what kept happening over and over. Either it left me behind when it sped up, or I hit it and just died. This was, I believe, when I had a different idea. Let me make sure. Right, I'm using recall repeatedly here, and this is because something the game teaches you a few times in shrines is that whenever an object is being affected by recall and it's moving backwards, if you cancel recall, the object loses all of its momentum and just falls straight down. I hoped that by using this, I could start and stop recall multiple times as the boulder is falling, so that every time that I cancel, it goes back to the original speed. However, by just activating recall and not hitting the boulder like I do in this clip, that doesn't happen. The speed doesn't reset and it just falls really fast like nothing happened. So here, what I do is hit recall on the boulder and cancel it the moment that it activates, but instead it just propels me upwards and I lose grip on it. So there really didn't seem to be a sweet spot, because doing it too early wouldn't affect the speed, and doing it too late would just kick me out of it. And on top of that, I kept over and over slipping off. This is why I'm rotating it here. I spent many minutes just rotating the boulders because over and over I just kept falling off. This is another desperate measure. I believe it's the same thing I tried before. Yeah, I'm trying to make the top boulder stop me after recall gets activated, but naturally that was not going to work. So after trying quite a few different things, such as 3 rocks, hoping something would change, and saving as far down as I could on the rock, hoping that I would be loading on the boss fight, I believe this is when I finally noticed what I was doing wrong, which is that the timing is very specific. The moment that I activate recall, this effect goes through the screen, and I need to deactivate it the moment that I can no longer see it. This is the sweet spot so that it's not too early or too late, and this is when I realized that this was working even though I slipped off. And well, I finally had the method. I was very happy to see that this would actually work, but I spent nearly 2 hours for this to finally work. I kept slipping off over and over, having to rotate the boulder over and over, and this is when I finally got it. The timing is not specific at all for when you have to cancel, just the moment you see the effect go off the screen. But the difficult part is not slipping off the boulder, because every time you affect it, you kind of nudge over, and that made it really annoying. So I was able to reach the final boss, and I can confirm every single phase is beatable. You need enough weapons, you don't need the glider, you would definitely do with an attack potion, but if you learn the patterns and you have weapons, you can, there's a horde of enemies at the beginning, so you can use all of their weapons when you kill them, which is very useful. I'm not going to show that because there's no point and it's going to make the video very long. But every single phase is beatable, including the final phase, where you would normally use a glider. It's not actually needed. So I was happy I was able to overcome every obstacle. I don't know if people have done this before, they probably have. But there is not information, so I wanted to find out for myself. I'm happy I was able to beat the game straight up, just like Breath of the Wild. And just for the record, I haven't uploaded anything in this channel in 7 years, since Breath of the Wild, so I thought I could make this a video. Thank you for watching, and see you someday, I guess.